Few people understand the Vatican better than John Allen, a senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter based in Rome. When Pope Benedict announced his resignation, John started doing his homework on the cardinals who will most likely be considered for the job. This is Habemus Papabili. Okay, John, Mark Willett, 68 years old, a fellow Canadian of mine, currently the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops. What do we need to know about Mark Willett?
Well, first let's start with the case for Mark Willett as a possible pope. One, he has an extraordinary intellect. I think many people would see him as cut from the same sort of cerebral cloth as Benedict XVI, comes out of the same theological circles, the Communio school founded by then Father Ratzinger in the years after the Second Vatican Council. So an extraordinary thinker. Second, a guy who in his own biography sort of brings the first world and the developing world together. 12 years off and on in Colombia as a missionary, somebody who has traveled widely, knows the situation facing the church in the far-flung corners of the earth, speaks 6 or 7 languages comfortably, a real cosmopolitan. And third, he's also somebody who knows where the bodies are buried in the Roman Curia, having put in 2 stints in the Vatican, 1 in the Council for Christian Unity, and now, of course, the all-important Congregation for Bishops. And Sebastian, I can assure you that if you're looking to win friends and influence people in the Catholic Church, having the power to name bishops is a pretty good way to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of people are concerned about reforming the Curia in some sense, the structure. Is Mark Willett capable of doing that?
I think that's the big question mark. I mean, certainly he is capable in the sense of knowing how the system works, working in a very important office in the Vatican that is a real decision-making organism. So he knows the system from the inside. And further, if you look at his track record as a pastor in Quebec, although he had external problems, certainly, but I think internally, he had a profile of somebody who ran a fairly tight ship. However, the question really is, and this is an odd thing to say as a knock against a papal candidate, but many people would say, is he maybe just too nice a guy for this job? I mean, does he have the steel in his spine, so to speak, to make the tough choices when it means sometimes disappointing, frustrating, or angering men you've seen as friends your entire life?
What about being a Canadian? Do you think that's a pro, that's a con? I mean, you've mentioned some of the factors about him coming from Quebec, but internationally speaking, a Canadian coming out on that balcony, what does that mean?
Well, you got to remember this is the Vatican, Sebastian, where we think in centuries. The working motto is talk to me on Tuesday and we'll get back to you in 300 years. So, for these guys, the new world is still new to them. And so I think that there is a kind of, I would say, anti-old guard spirit among some of the cardinals who are going to be voting in this conclave, a kind of desire to both substantively and symbolically break with old ways of doing business and embrace something new. So I think that's probably a plus for Willett, that he comes from North America. That said, I honestly believe nationality is a very secondary concern. I think they've got a checklist of things they're looking for, and if they can find them, it really doesn't matter what passport the guy holds.
Are you going to be surprised if he walks out on the balcony?
Well, at one level, you're always surprised when you see a new pope. I mean, I remember in 2005, a blind man could see that Cardinal Ratzinger had strong support going into that conclave. And yet, simply because I had known him for a long time and I was so accustomed to thinking of him as the right hand of the Pope, not the Pope himself, to see him standing on that balcony in the white vestments and delivering his Urbi et Orbi was a kind of shock to the system. And I would have a similar reaction to Mark Willett, somebody I've been at dinner tables with and I've been on stages with, and I've known him off and on over the years. At one level, politically, it would be one of the least surprising developments if he were to be elected, but personally, sure, it would be kind of stunning to see him standing there.
Angelo Scola, 71 years old, Italian, currently the Archbishop of a major diocese in Milan. What do we need to know about Cardinal Scola?
Well, Scola is probably the closest thing we have to a front-runner in this race, or at least a guy who seems to be at the top of most people's lists. There would be a temptation maybe to write him off on that basis on the grounds that he who enters a conclave as Pope comes out a cardinal, but like so much conventional wisdom, that's bunk half the time. Joseph Ratzinger went in as a Pope in 2005 and he came out on the other end as Pope too, so I think you have to take Scola fairly seriously. In terms of his intellectual outlook, and of course he is an intellectual. He's a specialist in moral anthropology, former rector at Rome's Lateran University, founder of the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Families, which now has a sort of branch campus at Catholic University in the States. Scola comes very much out of the same intellectual circles as Benedict XVI, part of the Communio school, along with Cardinal Ouellet from Canada and others. He also comes out of another circle, which is a Catholic movement born in Italy in the 50s by a Catholic priest by the name of Father Luigi Giussani, called Communion and Liberation, which is both a curse and a blessing for him. I mean, the blessing is, I think most people would see Giussani as one of the more interesting minds of the church in the 20th century. It also gives Cardinal Scola a base of support. But in the never-ending factional tribal rivalries of the Italian ecclesiastical scene, it also means there are some people who might be inclined to look at him, with a hermeneutic of suspicion, let's say. In addition, he also has a lot of pastoral experience governing complex dioceses and archdioceses. He was the Patriarch of Venice, which isn't that complicated in terms of its Catholic population. I mean, it's basically a large parish by North American standards, but because of its history, it's a big global platform. And now, of course, he's running the Archdiocese of Milan, arguably the most complicated, and certainly in terms of its infrastructure and its footprint, one of the biggest archdioceses in the world. So he brings a great deal of pastoral experience.
Benedict was a great theologian. Angelo Scola is a great theologian. Is there going to be, or could there be seen to be, perhaps a disconnect because of his theological mind with the average Catholic?
Well, I think the fear that Cardinal Scola, that a Papa Scola, would come off as a little dense and overly cerebral, is a concern among some people. I mean, I think there are some cardinals who would say we've had an extraordinarily intellectually rich papacy for the last 8 years. I mean, that is, the intellectual, scaffolding for the new evangelization has already been erected. Now we need somebody who can take the message to the street. And there might be some question about whether Cardinal Scola is the guy to do that. I mean, in my experience, having seen him in action over the years, I would say that when he comes off the cuff, that is, when he's playing the part of pastor rather than professor, he's terrific. I mean, he can be funny, he can be engaging, he can be accessible, he can put complex ideas in very simple formula. The problem is, if you let the guy sit at his desk for 3 hours and write an essay on moral anthropology, then, it's a little bit more of an acquired taste. But I don't think that the question about Scola is, can he be an evangelizer? I think the question is, does he have the right profile of the kind of evangelizer the church needs right now?
Does being an Italian help or hurt him or keep him neutral in this regard?
I think being an Italian is sort of a jump ball for anybody, including Cardinal Scola. I mean, on the one hand, there is, to be honest with you, something of an anti-Italian humor among some of the cardinals who are gathering for this conclave, not because they have any prejudice against Italians, but it's simply because they feel that the business management dimension of the Vatican has sort of gone off the rails over the last 8 years, and many of the people responsible for those breakdowns in their mind are Italians. And so I think there's a desire to shake that up a little bit. But on the other hand, they're also looking for somebody who knows the system from the inside, who they believe it's plausible to think could actually get it under control. The great thing about Cardinal Scola from that point of view is that, he's Italian and he's been in and out of the Roman scene his entire life, so he gets kind of insider credibility. But he's never actually worked in the Vatican, so, nobody can blame him for any particular thing they don't like. That might be a fairly attractive profile.
Cardinal Timothy Dolan, someone that you know very well. 63 years old, an American, Archbishop of the Big Apple, New York. What do we need to know about Cardinal Dolan?
First thing to know about Tim Dolan is what you're looking for in the next pope is an evangelizer and a missionary. This guy is evangelization on steroids. I mean, there is nobody in the College of Cardinals who can hold a candle to him in terms of media savvy, popular appeal, the ability to work a room, the ability to put a kind of positive face and voice in the Catholic message. When he came to Rome in February 2012 to get his red hat as a member of the College of Cardinals, I mean, he literally took this city by storm. Europeans, Italians in particular, are used to thinking of cardinals as these aloof, ethereal, aristocratic figures. Here is this back-slapping, baby-kissing, beer-guzzling freak of nature, and he just took their breath away. You know? Now, the thing about Dolan is that that charm is instinctive. I mean, it's who he is. But he's also, I think, quite conscious about, you know, how effective it is as an evangelical instrument. Because he is also, you know, in terms of the substance of his positions, I think most people would see him as fairly conservative. You know, he would be a man of unquestioned orthodoxy who would stand foursquare behind church positions that are sometimes a tough sell. On things like gay marriage and contraception and abortion. But I think, you know, his project, his life's work in a way, is to try to render those teachings in as positive a fashion as possible. That is, trying to accent what the church says yes to rather than what the church says no to. If the Cardinals are looking for somebody who is going to continue the intellectual and doctrinal inheritance of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, but be able to sell that package in a very competitive lifestyle marketplace in the early 21st century, Tim Dolan might well be their guy.
Cardinal Dolan exemplifies Americanism. Is the Universal Church, is the Catholic Church, is the church here in Europe ready for an American Pope, someone like Cardinal Dolan?
Well, I think the $64,000 question isn't whether they're ready for an American Pope. I think it's whether they're ready for this American Pope. Because, you know, Tim Dolan is American the way Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, was Polish. And by that I mean to his toes, okay? I mean, if he never opened his mouth just walking down the street from a mile away, that guy screams American, you know? He's this big, brash, loud, bold, swashbuckling personality. Remember when he was here in February 2012 for the consistory, I was standing in the Vatican press office, and a number of my colleagues from other parts of the world were standing around talking about Dolan. And one of them, a veteran French Vatican writer, said, "In my heart of hearts, I cannot believe the other cardinals would actually vote for a cowboy pope." And then he added, "But can you imagine how much fun it would be if they did?" Huh? I think that's the question. I think, you know, a lot of cardinals will look at Dolan and say that he is an extraordinarily impressive, almost scintillating public figure in behalf of the church. Might be just a little bit too much of a shock to the system as Pope.
What do you think the relationship is like between Cardinal Dolan and the other cardinals? Because he is this personality and it stands out. It's clearly, you know, it's something different than we see usually in the college. So how does that relationship work?
Well, Cardinal Dolan, of course, is the former rector of the North American College here in Rome. He's been a seminary formator all of his life. So the idea of the brotherhood of the priesthood and the brotherhood of the episcopate is very important to him. And I think he works hard to keep those relationships green, to be part of the club rather than towering above it. But, you know, in many ways, he can't help it. I mean, it's a little bit like John Paul II. I jokingly told somebody the other day that if they elect Tim Dolan Pope, the other 5,000 bishops of the Catholic Church might as well take the next 15 years off, because you're never going to see him or hear from him again. And I do think there are some in the college that would say having a pope who would be so ubiquitous and in some ways who would overshadow, you know, other layers of authority and other players in the church, that might be a question mark.
He's been known to poke a lot of fun at himself, especially his Italian. Is his Italian good enough?
Well, on the list of doubts about Tim Dolan as a pope, I think the being too American thing is probably number one. Number two would be, does he really have the kind of global vision and understanding of the church in diverse parts of the world? I mean, start with languages. You know, I mean, Dolan will be the first to admit that his Italian is basically spaghetti Italian, which means he can get by at restaurants, but that's about it. You know, as far as Spanish goes, the language spoken by almost half the Catholics in the world these days, let me just say, I've been at Guadalupe masses where Tim has tried to celebrate them, and all I can tell you is that the Mexicans are glad for the effort. You know, so I mean, I think this would be a question mark. On the other hand, in the same way that Wojtyła's deep Polishness opened him up to the world, precisely because he was so attached to his own culture, he could understand how other people were attached to theirs. I mean, you could make a similar argument for Dolan. I mean, okay, maybe he doesn't come into the job with the languages you would want or the life experience you would want, but this is a guy who's profoundly in love with his church and his country, and I think therefore could connect with the same sentiments that people in other parts of the world feel for themselves.
Odilo Pedro Scherer, 63 years old, a Brazilian, currently the Archbishop of Sao Paulo. What do we need to know about Cardinal Scherer?
Well, I think the first thing to know is that he's a very serious candidate to be the next pope, because he brings together a lot of things that the 115 cardinals who are going to be voting in this election seem to be looking for. I mean, one, they want somebody with a global vision who can embrace the global realities of the Catholic Church. Obviously, he comes from Latin America, represents the church outside the West. But he also is the son of German immigrants to Brazil, has strong ties in Germany and in Europe, so he sort of brings the first world and third world together. Second, the cardinals are looking for an evangelizer, somebody who can sort of promote the missionary dimension of the church. The secular equivalent of that is a salesman. They're looking for somebody who can move the Catholic product in a very competitive religious marketplace. And Cardinal Scherer certainly has experience of doing that. I mean, Brazil is a country that has seen its once almost homogenous Catholic environment be eaten away by exploding Pentecostal and evangelical sects. The Brazilian bishops have had to retool and relearn the fine art of evangelizing their own people. And so he would carry that experience with him into the papacy. Finally, the cardinals are looking for a governor, somebody who can get the Vatican under control. And of course, Cardinal Scherer is a protege of Cardinal Giambattista Re. He worked for him in the Congregation for Bishops. And so he has insider experience as well. So you start ticking off the items on the wish list, he does pretty well.
Is there something unique or special about the idea at this particular moment in history of a pope from Latin America specifically, not Europe, and then not some of the places where the faith is exploding for the first time?
Well, look, I think if the cardinals want to go outside the West, but they don't want to roll the dice, in many ways that logic leads them to Latin America. I mean, it's a continent with 6 centuries of Catholic tradition, well-established Catholic churches. And further, it's probably the pastoral experience that most closely parallels what it's like to be a bishop in the first world. I mean, you take a place like the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo. I mean, it's one of the most sprawling, Catholic jurisdictions on the face of the earth. It was so big and essentially ungovernable that a few years ago they split it up into 5, and the thing is still unwieldy. So having been forced to try to sort of, move the nuts and bolts of the apparatus in Sao Paulo, I think a lot of cardinals would say, yeah, Scherer represents the church outside the West, but he also has a lot of experience that's pretty close to ours.
What are some of the concerns when you talk about Cardinal Scherer?
Well, I think 2 things. I mean, one would be precisely because he is a protege of someone seen as part of the Vatican's old guard, that is Cardinal Giambattista Re. If you really want somebody who is going to break the mold and shake things up in the Vatican, somebody who comes out of those circles might not necessarily profile to you as the obvious choice. I think the other thing is most people would say about Scherer that he is a wonderful man personally. If you're at a dinner table with him or you're in informal conversation with him, he's witty and charming and accessible. But sometimes you put him on a big public stage and he can turn a little stiff. And if you're looking for an evangelizer, somebody who's going to turn the world on with their smile, that might not necessarily be the guy you would turn to.
Do you think that Rio 2013, the next World Youth Day, will factor into this decision?
Well, I don't think the cardinals who are going to elect the next pope are going to vote for a guy simply because it would be a great photo op in Rio in 2013. I think they're thinking in longer terms than that. But on the other hand, certainly the day one story, should Scherer be elected pope, would certainly be watch out for Rio, because this is going to be the biggest Catholic party of the 21st century.
Luis Antonio Tagle, one of the youngest cardinals, 55 years old, Filipino, currently the Archbishop of Manila. What do we need to know about Luis Antonio Tagle?
Well, I would say if the key voting issue in this conclave is the desire to find an evangelizer, that is, somebody who can really sort of set people on fire with enthusiasm for the faith, and if they want that evangelizer to come from outside the West, by a pretty short path, that leads you to Luis Antonio Chito Tagle. Chito is his nickname. This guy is a superstar of the Catholic Church in Asia. I mean, by some order of magnitude. He would be seen as the most charismatic, the most exciting, the most dynamic, the most attractive sort of face and voice for Asian Catholicism. And he does this. He doesn't have that kind of swashbuckling bravado that you associate with John Paul II. It's a much quieter, simpler, humbler sort of approach, quintessentially Asian in some ways, but it works. He has a wildly popular TV and radio program in the Philippines. I've seen him give speeches at Eucharistic congresses and other Catholic venues around the world, and there's not a dry eye in the house. I mean, the guy is just phenomenal. In addition to all that, he comes with real intellectual chops as well. I mean, you're talking about a guy who wrote his doctoral dissertation in church history at the Catholic University of America under Joseph Kamanchak, kind of the dean of American church historians. Contributed to the Alberigo and Maloney history of the Second Vatican Council, was a member of the editorial board there. So he blends real intellectual depth with real popular appeal.
There seems to be, in the images that we've seen of him with Pope Benedict, now Pope Emeritus, a real connection. They were both on the International Theological Commission. Talk a little bit about that. Is that significant in some way?
Well, a cute story there. I mean, Togli is only 55, and he looks like he's about 15. And the story goes that when he was first appointed to the International Theological Commission, then Cardinal Ratzinger was introducing the new members of the team to Pope John Paul II. And when he introduced Togli, he turns to John Paul and says, "Don't worry, he's had his confirmation," you know, precisely because he comes off as so youthful. But yeah, I think there is a connection there. Well, another thing we probably got to say about Togli, and I think part of his appeal, is that he has a reputation for being an extraordinarily simple man of the people. I mean, there are all kinds of stories. I interviewed a woman in his former diocese in the Philippines when he was named to Manila, who told me a story about how in his former diocese there was a kind of town square in front of the cathedral, and he was legendary for inviting people in that square in to have lunch with him and so forth. This woman told me the story that one day she had a husband who was a drunk who liked to sleep it off in this square, and so usually in the middle of the afternoon she would go looking for him, and this particular afternoon she couldn't find him, killed a couple of hours cruising bars to see if she could round him up. Finally somebody said, "Oh no, he's in with the bishop." Togli had brought him in and sort of given him some coffee to sober him up and given him some food and was just sitting with him and talking. You know, he also is famous for taking the bus to work, for riding around town on his bike. I mean, he not only is that his personality, but he's also able to give that a kind of evangelical and theological logic. At the Synod for Bishops on the New Evangelization last year, of the hundreds and hundreds of speeches that are given during these things, his was probably one of the 2 or 3 that people actually remembered, because what he said is that if we are going to evangelize successfully in the 21st century, we need 3 qualities. We need a church that is humbler, a church that is simpler, and a church that has a more developed capacity for silence. I think that left a very deep impression on the people in that hall.
He's one of the youngest cardinals, as I mentioned. How significant is that question of age when you're looking at the candidates for the next pope?
Well, I mean, you know, traditionally, the cardinals are trying to split the difference between somebody who is too young so they'd have an overly long papacy and somebody who is too old so they'd have an overly short papacy. So usually the conventional wisdom is they're looking for somebody in their mid-60s or so. Togli obviously is not in that window, and I do think that would be a question mark. On the other hand, you know, now that the precedent has been set that a pope can resign, it's no longer unthinkable. You know, I think some cardinals might say, well, you know, he could give us 10 or 15 years and then step off the stage and make room for someone else. So I think that may have upset the apple cart, so to speak, in the previous conventional wisdom about age as a deterrent.
What about pastoral experience? Being relatively young in the college, he doesn't have some of the pastoral experience, the length of pastoral experience that some of these guys do. Is that a question mark?
I think there are 2 great question marks about Togli, and probably why he's got to be considered a long shot. One, as you say, although he now runs a very, very complex archdiocese in Manila, he hasn't been there very long. And so there would be some question about, you know, has he had the necessary seasoning? I mean, I think a lot of guys might be inclined to look at him and say, he'd be a great pope, but not yet. And I think the other big knock is that it seems clear to me and to most observers that governance is a very important issue heading into this conclave, particularly the ability to get the Vatican bureaucracy under control. I'm not sure a guy who would need a guided tour of the Apostolic Palace necessarily is going to strike a number of cardinals as the obvious choice to lead that reform.
What do you think the reaction of the world would be, though, if he walked out on the balcony?
If Cardinal Togli walks out on that balcony as the next pope, I think the day one headlines is the Catholic Church has got a rock star. You know, I mean, there would just be, first of all, the images from Manila. I mean, you would think the Philippines had just won the World Cup, okay, in terms of the eruption of enthusiasm you would see there. And of course, as we know, given the Philippine diaspora all over the world these days, there would be parties in the streets of Saudi Arabia. There would be parties in the streets of Rome. You know, Toronto, I mean, you know, all around the map. And further, I just think those early images of this short, beaming, simple, and yet deeply intelligent and deeply articulate Asian man would take the world by storm.
Okay, John, Leonardo Sandri, 69 years old, Argentinian, currently the prefect of the Congregation for the Eastern Churches. What do we need to know about Cardinal Sandri?
Well, Sebastian, I think the Cardinals who are going to be voting in this conclave are really looking for three things. They're looking for somebody with global vision who can somehow embrace the 2/3 of Catholics today, the 1.2 billion Catholics in the world who live outside the West. Secondly, they're looking for an evangelizer, somebody who can relight the missionary fires of the church. And third, they're looking for a governor, somebody who can get his hands around the administrative dimension of the papacy, and in particular, clean up the act in the Roman Curia in the Vatican. Sandri, in many ways, sort of ticks all those boxes. I mean, as you say, born in Argentina, so he would sort of symbolize the church outside the West, but functionally, he's an Italian. He spent his entire life in Rome, working inside the system in the Holy See and in papal embassies around the world. So be very well suited as a bishop of Rome, but his biography brings the first world and third world together. You know, in terms of an evangelist, he doesn't have any pastoral experience. That is, he's never run a diocese, which would be the knock against him. But he has played on an awfully big stage here in Rome. He was the man who, in April 2005, stepped out to inform the crowd in St. Peter's Square that John Paul was dead, using that memorable line, "Tonight we all feel as if we're orphans because we have lost our father." He knows what it's like to be there when the Klieg lights are on. And third, if you're looking for a governor, I think most guys would say this is the guy who can make the trains run on time. You know, he was the substitute, sort of the chief of staff under John Paul II. And many people would think that during those years, during his term, the system worked very well. So if you're looking for somebody who can get his hands around the behemoth of the bureaucracy in the Holy See, a lot of people would say that guy is Leonardo Sandri.
He has that administrative experience. Does having that experience come with some baggage too?
It always does. I mean, when you've been responsible for anything for a long period of time, then people are going to associate both what they like about that administration and what they don't like about it with you. Of course, he worked under Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the former Secretary of State, who is now the Dean of the College of Cardinals. Cardinal Sodano's tenure was controversial. There were aspects of it that people think come with some baggage. But on the other hand, you know, the trick in trying to find a governor in this election is to find somebody who is enough of an insider that you think it's plausible that they could get the place under control, but enough of an outsider that you don't associate them with things you don't like. Now, Sandri's good fortune in that regard is that he left the role of being a substitute around the same time that Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, the current Secretary of State, took over. And frankly, most people would say the breakdowns in Vatican governance over the last 8 years that they really want to fix, they would associate with Bertone and not with Sandri. So he might profile as the solution rather than the problem.
One of the characteristics that a lot of people are talking about when they're looking for the new pope is almost like a tangible holiness, a charisma, something that you can immediately connect with people. Does Sandri have that?
Well, I don't know that Sandri sort of radiates prayerfulness in the same way that, say, Benedict XVI does, or a guy like Cardinal Mark Ouellet would, who you can just sort of almost smell the spirituality wafting off of them. I mean, it's obvious that their thinking comes from a lot of time on their knees. You know, Sandri is a career diplomat. You know, he's a bit more breezy and a bit more sort of earthy than that. But I think that in many ways is part of his charm. I mean, there's a real faith underneath that, obviously. But, you know, he has the capacity to engage people from a wide variety of walks of life and sort of make the whole Catholic shtick, if you like, seem reasonable to them and it seem accessible to them. So it's not overt holiness in the way that some other figures produce it, but it is kind of a charming, relaxed, informal sort of point of entry into the Catholic experience.
Thanks very much, John.
You're welcome.